I'm pretty certain I don't need to tell all of you that this last year has been a pretty devastating one for the cultural sector at large. For many of our organizations, it's been a year of furloughs, of diminished capacity, programmatic pivoting, lost revenue, and I can assure you that the data is there that backs all of it up. It's real and it is happening. And I think when times are tough, it can be really tempting as cultural organizations to turn our focus inward, to get caught up in being frustrated at what we can't do or what we can no longer do or what we had wanted to do. But my role this morning and what I hope to do is to focus on what is working right now. And I can guarantee you that that isn't it, right? Getting bogged down in what we can't do. Just like that doesn't work very well for us as individual humans, it doesn't work very well for our organizations either. So for a lot of organizations, it seemed like the challenges have just kept on coming for the last full year now. But inherent in one of the biggest challenges lies one of our biggest opportunities, and that is that our audiences and our communities and our organizations have changed during the last year. We're not the same. So what do we do with that information, standing where we are now and figuring out where to go? And I think our first move is to not expect everything to be the same or to go back to the way it was, because expectations are half the battle, right? So a few things I want to lay out as sort of my premises here. One is that we don't get out of this the way we came in. So we're not going to emerge and suddenly have it be November of 2019 again. It's not going to happen, and I'm not sure we actually want it to. It's easy to look with those rose-colored glasses at where we were a year and a half ago, but I'm not sure that's really where we want to be headed. The next is that there's really no straight line from here to normal. It's not going to look like a clear, straight trajectory. And I think when the year turned over, we all sort of hoped that would happen. Okay, it's not 2020 anymore. Now we're on a straight path from here to normal, whatever the heck that is. And I'm not so sure it's going to be such a straight path. And I'm not sure normal was really so great anyway. I think there were a lot of things that weren't right with our industry and our field and our organizations and our connections with our communities that we have an opportunity to reboot a bit. And I think we want to take that opportunity where we can have it. The other thing I'll say is that in this moment of in this year of pandemic, coupled with a renewed attention to racial injustice, fresh on our minds from yesterday, and it's been of course, throughout the year and many, many years, the expectations, and we'll talk more about this, the expectations that are had of our organizations that we need to have of ourselves have evolved and have changed. So let's talk for a minute about where we are and how we got here. I already mentioned that our field as a whole struggling. You know that. Slashed budgets, uncertain income, lack of clarity about how to plan or budget or engage audiences during this time. And we'll talk more about some of the ways we can move forward in that uncertainty when we get to that part. But one of the big pieces we're going to have to get right is meaningful engagement with our audiences and communities. And if you asked me, Sarah, what is one thing that has made organizations survive and find success over the past year, that would be it. It's a deep rooting in and connection to the communities that those organizations serve. Really understanding the role that they play in people's lives. So not just what product they offer, but what does that actually do for people in my community? Because when you can understand the impact, you can find new ways to achieve that impact much more easily than if you're not really sure what it is you're accomplishing anyway. So our goal, with apologies to David Bowie, is to turn and face the strange, right? Not to ignore it, not to pretend it didn't happen, because that's just not going to work. So let's turn and let's face it and try our best to understand it, knowing that that's going to be an evolving process for all of us. So we're going to begin by looking at some data, and I like equating things that are really important to bacon because bacon is really important to me and I really like it. So I think data is probably not the new bacon anymore, but it is nonetheless some bacon, something we should love and rely on to get us through some difficult times. Am I getting a little too into bacon? Okay, I'm gonna let it go now. So let me offer, though, a couple of caveats. The data that I'm going to present are national data. They are not Wichita Falls data. So we need to understand them in that context and use those data as a jumping off point to think critically about our local context, to think of new questions that we might want to ask. So using it as a jumping off point to sort of study locally and think critically about what's going on. I also want to acknowledge that data is changing incredibly quickly right now. And the reality is that large data collection efforts can't keep up with the speed with which things are changing by and large, especially by the time they get around to reporting it to people like us. So what do? Do we throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, oh, this was from June, there's nothing we can learn from this? No, again, we chew the data, we don't swallow it whole, right? We ask questions, we think critically about it and say, what can we learn from this? What new questions can we be asking in our local context, of our audiences, of our staff members, of our board members, that we can then bring to our practice to inform what we're doing and where we're going. So let's think a bit about where we've been. The data I'm going to pull from right now come from a study being done by Laplace Study with Slover Linnet Audience Research. And I want to look at this data in the context of understanding two things about where our audiences are and have been and what they are needing from us. So the first is that our audiences have specific needs and desires of our cultural organizations and what they expect of their interactions with us. And the second is that those expectations are evolving and they're clarifying. I think that's the word I'd really put to what's happened in the last year. A lot of this data, as I mentioned, was actually collected prior to May 19th of last year, a long time ago. And we saw it sort of diminish over the summer as numbers went down. And then as numbers went back up, suddenly it all was super relevant again. So we're riding this wave and some of these responses go with it. There are probably a lot of questions we would ask now that they hadn't thought of yet then. And there might even be answers that have changed. So again, remember, this is our jumping off point to think critically and to study locally. Some of this is probably going to be common sense as you think about your own experiences going through the pandemic, either as individuals or as leaders of arts organizations. And if you need to move the people around on your screen so you can see all the bars, feel free, do whatever you need to, it won't bother anything. So when we think about what people need from our organizations, we often focus on our programs. What do they need of what we're offering? But during this time of pandemic, we've had an opportunity and a challenge to address what people want and need on a more basic level. When we look at the motivators for attending arts events, performing or visual arts events, so it could be a production, a gallery exhibit, anything along those lines, even in pre-COVID circumstances, or what we sometimes think of now as the best of circumstances, right? What people tell us in general that they want are opportunities to socialize with friends and family and the chance to have fun. Now, fun doesn't have to mean everything I go do is a comedy, right? People can report that they had fun at the Holocaust Museum. And what they're really saying is I had a meaningful interaction with the people I went with. I really got something out of it that I was looking for. Something I needed was met by this experience. So early on in the pandemic, people were telling us, not surprisingly, these are arts audiences, real live arts audiences, were telling us that they were disconnected, felt disconnected and worried and bored. Probably not a big shock, right? I suspect and hope that you've explored what your mission looks like when it's applied to those problems over the past year. Moving forward, these are going to shift, right? I think as the weather gets nicer, we're going to see some boredom decrease. I think as the vaccination rollout has progressed, we're starting to see some hopefulness return. But As organizations, we need to be considering, how will we know when those shifts are happening for our audience and in our community? How are we going to diagnose when we're turning that corner on feeling really bummed out to feeling hopeful and ready and primed to engage? How will we know when that boredom is decreasing, or when we have a renewed opportunity to relieve that boredom for our organizations? How will your mission apply then? I'll say more about this later, but just like 2020, 2021 is going to be a time of rapid iteration. Audiences are not just going to reappear because we open the doors. We'll be challenged, I think, to send a lot of messages for a lot of varied programmatic engagement options to a lot of different people. Our old segmenting and targeting may not hold up really well, or may not be enough because we've engaged different people in different ways during the pandemic. So we need to be concerned with how we make what we're offering as organizations resonate with our audiences, even as those behaviors and needs shift and change and continue to evolve. So in case we didn't hear them the first time, here it is again. People want to get connected. People want to have fun. And as I mentioned, those are precisely the reasons people have told us for ages now that they want to engage in and attend the arts. So it should always be part of how we're engaging our people. And but I say our people because it could be our current audiences, our prospective audiences, our communities at large, our colleague organizations. Our tactics may be different now than they were a year ago. They'll need to continue to change quite a bit over the next several months. But the fundamental reasons why people want to engage with us, what they want out of their experiences with cultural organizations, have not necessarily changed all that much, at least not those headline pieces. So that's good. We like things that haven't changed in a world where a lot's changed. And those are things that we can kind of hang our hat on a bit. We often misconstrue what people value about us as arts organizations to make it sound a little more fancy than it is sometimes. If you think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we like to put ourselves up at the tippy top in that realm of self-actualization, becoming fully fledged humans and all of this really grand sounding things. And yes, the arts can do that, absolutely. But the arts can also serve a much more basic function of creating some human connection when I really need it. And so we don't want to relegate ourselves just up to the tippy top when we could be infusing ourselves through people's lives in much more fundamental and basic ways and engage earlier in the process, right, than when they're ready to get to that tippy top. All right. So now let's take a look at what audiences say they were expecting or desiring from their engagement with cultural organizations during this time, because it's not too different. They wanted us to help them have fun and relax. And early on in particular, they really wanted to help us educate their children. I think that has alleviated some as school systems and other educational bodies have figured out their role a bit. But it is still something to keep in mind as summer months approach, what that might look like. Camp things may be different, etc. So people are telling us what we can do for them, right? That's great. A lot of the messaging I've seen come out of cultural institutions over the past year is, we are so important. Our work is so essential, support us. And that's true, and that's good. But we also need to be able to communicate our service, right? Not just, we're important help, but here's what we're doing for you. And then we can explain to donors or audience members or other supporters that supporting us will fill their needs and it'll resonate because it's actually happening, right? We can't just say it and not do it. But if we've found those points of connection that will help us help them feel connected and meet those needs, and we can communicate that back, they're going to see that we're filling those needs and we'll be able to create more sustainable relationships with them. So put another way, even as our organizations are struggling, and heaven knows that they are, it just can't be all about us. If we can serve our audience's needs, then fulfilling our needs can follow. We serve a mission and we have an obligation to serve our communities. So how do we serve that need in a mission appropriate and capacity viable way? And you will hear me use those two terms several times, in a mission appropriate and capacity viable way, because we need to be considering those, especially at a time when our capacity can be diminished. All right, moving on here. So here's some more of this, and I want to acknowledge for a moment the absurdity. You may be thinking, lady, I'm a small to mid-sized cultural organization. How the heck do you expect me to deal with people's financial and economic problems, offer a distraction in the crisis, help them express themselves creatively, grieve, and have fun? I can't do all those things at once, right? And that is absolutely true. We cannot shoot the moon. And that's not what I'm proposing or asking you to do here at all. What I am asking you to do is recalibrate and focus. Figure out what it is of these things or something else that your audience really needs from you and focus in on that. How can you provide that thing in their lives at this moment? So expectations, some of what people are expecting or have been expecting from our organizations has been very practical. Audiences as a whole are expecting cultural organizations to know when it's safe to open again and what that's going to look like. That's not an expectation they've had to have of us before, nor is it one we've had to have of ourselves to be making those kinds of decisions. They are going to be expecting us on the whole to do all we can to keep them safe inside of our walls, and likely won't be terribly moved by our explanations or excuses if we fail to do so. But they also have desires and expectations in terms of what they want to see from our organizations more broadly. This is the last of this set of slides, and maybe one of the most important here. Our audience's expectations, are they changing? Maybe. They're certainly evolving. And I think they're clarifying, both for them and for our organizations. What we know is that our audiences want us as a field and as organizations and institutions to change compared to what they believe to be true about us as a whole back in the beginning of 2019. So if this, what we see here, the change that our audiences want to see from us, doesn't say it's not all about you guys, I don't know what will, right? They want us to be friendlier to all kinds of people, to be engaging more diverse voices and faces, to be more fun and less formal and reflect the stories that relate to all of our communities' lives. No one here said the change I really want to see is more high-profile violinists. That's really what I want, right? Now, high-profile violinists are great. What are they helping you accomplish as an organization and in relationship to your community? So we have to be able to get over the ego and the fear that's wrapped up in the uncertainty of this moment and the uncertainty of the last year, and remember that we're in the business of serving our communities through our missions, through the arts and cultural activity. And that being said, remember, of course, that we need to be doing it in mission appropriate and capacity viable ways. For those who are leading organizations, I think we really have to be able to find ways to let our thinking get past the internally focused survival mode and into meaningful engagement. We have to be the translators who make all this amazing work that you have been doing, have been waiting to do, are ready to do. We have to be the translators that make that all matter to our people. All right. So where we are, all of those things we just talked about continue to evolve. It's where we have been, but it's also where we are, and some of it's where we're going to. We can't draw a line and say, oh, on January 1st, everything changed as much as we wanted to. It didn't. And new things are still emerging and evolving as well. So as we build on what we've just discussed, I want to consider where we are now and start here, because I think this is the question I get asked more than any other these days. And maybe you're not worried about it, but maybe you are. The top one is, will my audience ever come back? And it sounds like, from what I've heard from Anne, Wichita Falls audiences are saying, yeah, We're going to come back. We're ready. And the good news across the board is that yes, audiences seem to miss us and they desire to re-engage. So that's big because of the comparative isolation of COVID has served to clarify for a lot of us, I think, what we do and do not want to live without. So I discovered, for example, that I make way better coffee than Starbucks. So I do not particularly desire to return to spending lots of money at Starbucks, right? I don't need that. I can do without that and life's great. These things have clarified in a lot of our minds. And what seems to be what audiences are telling us is we miss this. We care. We want this back in our lives. So that's good news for us. The asterisk is that intent does not always equal behavior. And I'm not particularly concerned about this in terms of audiences saying, just kidding, actually, we don't want to come back to the arts. I think they do. I think that's real and that's going to happen. But the speed at which they do it may not match what they tell us at the beginning. So early on in the pandemic, a lot of our conversations in the sort of arts data world were around intent to return. When do people plan to come back? And at first we were putting all these measurements. Is it a week? Is it 3 weeks? Is it 3 months? What's the time frame going to be? But what data showed were that everyone always thought things would be normal in 6 months. So it didn't matter if it was June or November, in 6 months, people thought things would be back to normal. And short-term data, my intent to return, do I think I'm going to go back in X amount of time, was tightly strapped to a roller coaster that was dependent on localized COVID numbers and at times also incidents of civic unrest. So if my little community's having a spike or if my region's having a spike, it's going to be way longer before I think I'm going to go back. And if my numbers get good, oh, I'm going to go back next week. You know, it just was riding this roller coaster that meant it really wasn't anything we could rely on or plan on. So at the organizational level, people were surveying, right? When do you think you'll come back? Would you come to X kind of virtual program? Would you come to Y kind of live programming? What would you do? And we were seeing, in some cases, very promising levels of intent to engage in any number of ways, virtual or live, but then behaviors weren't bearing out that intent. I do think that will begin to shift now that we are seeing more widespread uptake of the vaccine. I think we're going to be moving in a direction where intent will match a bit more, but that's also always been true. Sarah, do you want to go do this sometime in the next 3 weeks? Yeah, that sounds awesome. Okay, Sarah, do you want to do it tonight? No, not really, right? Our intention and our behaviors just don't always quite match. So we have to take that with a bit of a grain of salt. So then the question became, if we can't figure out when people will come back, can we at least figure out what we're going to need to do to try to make people more comfortable, to try to get them to come back? And this is, I think, part of where we are right now. What's that special sauce going to look like that makes people feel safe, makes us feel confident that we're keeping people safe, et cetera? And the issue with this data is that only a few of these things are within our control as cultural organizations. I'll come back to the matter of vaccines again in a few minutes. We absolutely need, to the best of our abilities, to be addressing these public health matters. And I'll be really interested to hear what you all think, because I know in Texas, there's been a grand reopening. And so what does that mean for you and the decisions that you want to make? Because that impetus is going to be on you to make those decisions about what does safe look like for our community. And that may be very different in Wichita Falls than where I am in Columbia, Missouri, based on our local realities, risk tolerance, and any number of different things. So while we do need to address, again, those health matters to the best of our ability, it's easy to get so bogged down in the internal details and systems and tactics of exactly how we're going to do it and how much authority do our ushers have to kick somebody out that's not following the rules and what kind of PR nightmare is that going to be, and questions, that we miss out on the engagement that I think is so critical to sustaining our relationships with our audiences during this time that's going to then sustain us post-COVID. So I don't have a crystal ball that's going to show us the timing and pace of these changes. I wish I did. That would be really, really wonderful. But what we need to do is to lean into our engagement with our communities and the relationships that we have, learn to ask good questions and remain nimble. And that's going to be a through line through a lot of the rest of what I share this morning. While we can seek to influence people's behavior and say, it really is safe to come back when I'm nervous about going back, we're also wise to accept what our audiences are telling us, with, again, that asterisk about intent and behavior, right? But if they're saying we are ready, okay, how do we do that? And how do we do that in a way that's going to make our organizations comfortable? If they say we are not ready, is it really our best move to fight that? Or are we in a better place to embrace it and say, okay, then how do we deal with that reality? I think fighting whatever the reality is runs the risk of making us just appear more disconnected from our communities. And that's not something that will serve us well. We also need to acknowledge that COVID has not happened in a vacuum and that our audience's expectations have shifted in terms of meaningful inclusivity, and our organization's expectations ought to have changed for ourselves as well. And if they haven't yet, I invite you to consider this a good time to do that, particularly if you are in a white-led organization. So why do we need to be doing this now? Why not say, okay, Sarah, but we'll do that when everything's back to normal? Well, first of all, the expectations have already changed. So we're in a situation where if we're not moving forward. If we're standing still, we're actually moving backward, right? Did that make sense? If we're standing still, we're functionally moving backward because things have moved along with us or without us. Why do we do it? First, it's right. Black Lives Matter. Our Asian neighbors are wonderful and integral parts of our communities. And Black, Indigenous, and people of color should feel like a part of our cultural organizations, not just invited to partake of what it is that we have on offer. Recall that even in that data from last May, right? Even before the murder of George Floyd, before the protests throughout the summer, 24% of arts audiences were saying that they wanted our organizations to be friendlier to all kinds of people. And 18% were already saying they wanted more diverse voices and faces. And I think with the resurgent awareness of longstanding systemic racial injustice, those numbers probably would report higher now. So this can't wait until we're up and running again, because it's going to involve naming and addressing racism and white privilege in many of our organizations from top to bottom. And that extends to male privilege, that extends to straight privilege, that extends to all those areas where we have historically excluded and offered an invitation to eat what I'm serving, but not really to be part of designing the meal, right? So our audiences are increasingly making it clear that this is truly an expectation they have of our organizations. And I'm seeing and hearing this reflected in communities across the country already. Programs that predominantly from white-led organizations that were considered innovative a year ago. Now people are like, yeah, come on, guys, that's bare minimum. You got to do better than that. And then additionally, we won't successfully build and retain audiences that reflect the diversity of our communities until we go past inviting to true inclusion. We'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. We also need to remember, though, that as we seek to do that, sort of the same old isn't going to suddenly resonate with new people just because we want it to. So we're going to have to find new ways to talk about what we're doing. We're going to have new voices at decision-making tables, et cetera. So I want to highlight a few things that also came out of that LaPlaca-Cohen study that relate to this specifically. So I just have 3 statistics that I want to send your way here. One is that the desire to see change in the arts and cultural community was ubiquitous. It was across the board, Black, white, brown, male, female, gay, straight, the whole 9 yards. But audiences of color reported that more frequently. They wanted to see changes. And in particular, they said on the whole, remember these are broad strokes data, They wanted to see organizations be more inclusive and community-centered, more casual and enjoyable, and creating relevant and innovative content that reflects their communities. Remember that what I perceive as a white woman as inclusive or casual and enjoyable may have nothing to do with what someone else perceives as casual and enjoyable. And so I can't just use my own perspective. Each of us is limited by our own perspectives. So while Americans in general have reported that they miss the social elements of cultural experiences, those who identify as Black or African American were more likely to say they missed how these organizations helped them feel relaxed. And Native Americans were more likely to say that they missed these celebrations of their own cultural heritage. And finally, and this was a big question mark many of us had as we started this whole digital and virtual engagement experiment over the last year, would it help us diversify our audiences? On the national level, because your mileage may vary considerably as an individual organization, but on the national level, the answer is yes. We have seen a higher proportion of folks who have engaged in a digital-only matter, that a higher proportion of those audiences are Black or African American or Hispanic or Latinx than the audience is that visited venues in person. So yes, there is a potential there, but we cannot expect folks who have engaged with us virtually of any kind just to automatically engage with us live when we reopen. There's going to have to be a cultivation process there. So I know I've been focusing a lot on the external, but I think I would be remiss if I don't also touch on how some of the internal components are engaged here, internal components of our organizations. Where we are now is a land of a whole lot of questions, I think. How much money is it safe to sink into a production or exhibit? Will I have to shut down again if there's a new exposure or a spike in my community? What if my show causes an outbreak? Can I weather that PR storm? How do I know if I have enough revenue to really bring my staff back on? What's the tipping point? How do I make that decision? This lady on my webinar is telling me to diversify, but how do I actually do that? And also this lady is telling me to be relevant, but what does that even actually mean? And how do I know what my audience wants? And how do I plan if intent doesn't equal behavior? And on and on and on, right? Sorry, did I just stress you all out like a whole lot? It kind of stressed me out to read through those things. It seemed like a great idea when I wrote it down. So all those questions, if we let them overwhelm us, will drive us back to business as usual from 13 months ago, and that's not the name of the game. So we have to break it apart into pieces, into discrete questions, and handle them one at a time and find the connections as they come and then make them. So that's where we are, right? It's a little uncomfortable, isn't it? I feel a little uncomfortable. I'm like, I should have said something else, but that's where we are in this moment of question marks. What's been working during this time? Spoiler alert, it's things that have always been working and always will work. Understanding your own organization truly. What's your identity? That's rooted in mission, but it goes deeper than mission. What are you all about? What makes you tick? What are your values? And what role do you play in people's lives? I don't just mean we're the theater, but we're the escape. We're the place where they can gather outside with their family and friends, and it's cool for their kids to run amok so they don't have to get childcare. Whatever we are, what is the role, the functional role we're playing in people's lives? The aspirational role, there are a lot of different kinds. We'll talk about that at the end. Understanding your audience. What do they need that you can provide? This is donor relations 101, right? We don't go to donors and say, we need this and we need this and we need this and we need this, so give us your money. We try to connect with donors by understanding what do they need and how does our organization fulfill their need? And we sell that to them and hopefully they give us money, right? Same thing with audiences, same thing with prospective board members, same thing with corporate partners, same thing with other arts organizations you want to collaborate with. What's the need and how can you meet it? And what makes your audiences tick? What do they geek out on? What are they excited about? And where do your interests and values and their interests and values connect? And the next thing I want to highlight is engagement beyond your literal, if you have them, or if not figurative, four walls. This is not the moment to be all about yourselves. Collaboration, partnership, engagement, and what's going on in the world beyond your front door is critical. All right. So where we've been and where we are is not like the most fun thing to spend a lot of time thinking about. So let's think a little bit about where we're going and what the heck we can do about all of this. All right. Again, I have no crystal ball. I wish I did, but this is what I see coming down the road for us. So the first thing I want to talk about is vaccines, because this is both where we are and where we're going. Data are indicating that vaccine uptake is going to have a substantial influence on audience return and the near-term health of the cultural sector. And I don't mean our physical health, though that's true. I mean our fiscal health and the ability to keep more organization doors open. There is a webinar if you want more on this. There are a couple actually. Some of you may be familiar with the Audience Outlook Monitor that's been put out by Wolf Brown and AMS Planning and Research. And all these things I'm referencing, the LaPlaca-Cohen data and this, are freely available online. I don't like to use data that's hidden behind a paywall. I like to use things you can go and find for yourselves and put them into practice for your organization. There are a couple of webinars which you can access on the Audience Outlook Monitor website, where Alan Brown, who's a respected researcher, does lots of stuff with audience and engagement, breaks down kind of where we are with vaccines and what people are saying and why it matters for our organizations that we have widespread community uptake of vaccination. And obviously every community is in a different place with that. I was speaking to a colleague in Utah yesterday who said, well, yeah, I've been vaccinated, even though I should be one of the last people on the list because nobody here will take it. So now I can get it. Okay. But that's going to have repercussions within the community because they're going to be things that are less safe for longer as a result. And that will impact cultural organizations. So consider influencing as you can. That's going to be different for each of our organizations, and our comfort level will be. But take a listen to some of his data. It's really interesting, I think. And he makes a case for the engagement of the arts in promoting vaccination. Planning. This has been tricky. I think there are a lot of organizations, and now I am going to focus a little more internally. What can we be doing as organizations to face what's coming down the pike? We need to be planning, right? We need to be scenario planning. We need to plan like our events are going to happen the way we want them to happen, whether that's live or virtual. And then we need to have plan B and maybe C still. That need hasn't gone away yet. We need to be planning in both the short and medium term. What is my plan from now to June? What is my plan from now to September? What is my plan from now to December? And what am I going to do when I have to stop and turn again? How have I built that agility into my plans? For a lot of organizations, and I don't know where yours are, you can tell me that. For a lot of organizations, strategic plans kind of got a chuck about a year ago, which is really too bad, because if they were good strategic plans, those goals probably shouldn't have changed a whole lot. Those big picture goals, what is our organization all about? And another through line I can tell you I'm seeing with organizations that have found success in the last year is that they recognized what those big goals were, and they just changed all the how underneath it, or as much of the how as they needed to. So if my big goal is to infuse my community with the arts, as it is for one of my small arts council clients, right? Well, did they do that with a bunch of performances? No, but did they ramp up their public art program? Yeah, because they could have a single artist out there painting something. And then they could do a self-guided tour through the public art, right? There are things that they could do to still pursue those goals. There are a lot of folks like me who are out there right now looking at alternative models to strategic planning that aren't a 3-year plan for right now, because planning for 3 years right now, I don't believe makes sense yet. And I'm sure you could find someone that would disagree with me on that, because we're all going to have different perspectives. I think it will again before long, and it'll be interesting to see where we kind of land on that time frame. But right now, getting organizations thinking strategically again now, creating sort of a dashboard approach. How do we gauge this? Is this getting us where we want to go? Is this an opportunity we should take or pursue? I think is going to be really important. So you can look for help with approaches like that, that don't look like the strategic plan I would have started you off on a year ago, but do look like something that's going to guide your organization now. We need to also be planning for disruption. And I mean that both in terms of, listen, you may open a show and have to close it because we've got a new variant and somebody gets sick. I hope that doesn't happen. I hope you'll be able to shred that plan up in a year and say, glad we never had to use that. But we need to be able to plan for that kind of disruption. And we need to be planning for disruption in the long term. What the scientists and epidemiologists are telling us is this is not the last time this is going to happen. Gosh, I hope they're wrong. But we need to be prepared for any number of kinds of disasters or disruptions to our work. And in the past, I think we've considered a lot of our disaster planning in regard to flooding, hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, things that would disrupt our space, might disrupt things for 2 weeks. Remember when we thought this was going to be a 2-week disruption? That was just a year ago. We've learned that disruptions can last much longer than that. So what changes do we want to put in place? What processes do we want to have in place? And the good news is that any plan for disruption or emergency preparedness will help you in any other eventuality, because we tend to presume disasters we've experienced before, and it might be something different next time. But anything we've done is going to help us have those systems in place that will sustain us. So plan, yes, do it. You need to plan and you need to scenario plan. So not just plan A and assume it's all going to work. We need to know what our B and C are, what triggers us changing from B to C or A to B. Get ready to do some longer range planning again, maybe in 6 months. We'll see. Maybe I just think everything will be at that point in 6 months, just like the folks answering that survey. But be ready, be watching for that time when it's time to do it again. And if you don't know what those goals are that you're pursuing as an organization, it's time right now to at least do some. Relatedly, budgeting. We need to be doing it, and we need to be reevaluating it really, really regularly. So make your annual budget. Go ahead. Get it approved by the board, do your thing. But know that the first time you open a show, that whole budget comes up for discussion again when we find out that revenue didn't track the way we thought it would, or revenue far exceeded what we thought it would, or, oh, building supplies are really expensive right now and building the set was, ooh, buddy, okay, that's going to be a totally different budget than we would have anticipated a year ago. So do your planning, but be prepared and get your board and your staff, if you have them, engaged in a really consistent evaluation of how your actuals are comparing to your budget so that you can modify and you don't get yourselves in trouble over the course of the year. Collaboration, both internally and externally. I don't think I probably need to say a whole lot about this. I think that we're going to see a continuing interest in arts and from the funding community. Where the funding community lands coming out of this is one of the big question marks, I think, as an arts field we're looking at right now. Internal collaboration, though, that cross-departmental real talk, right? That, you know, your marketing folks may know that community inside out and upside down and backwards, and you want them at that programming table. You should always want them at the programming table, but now you've got to have them at the programming table. So make sure that everybody's talking to everybody. Internally, it's a great time to be engaging with the other cultural organizations in your community. We've seen cultural organizations and human service organizations partnering in some really interesting ways over the last year. What might that look like moving forward? Be ready to bring all of the creativity that you bring to your normal programming to the operations of your organization. We are creative people. We should be leading the charge here. We should be the best at this, right? But we often like to keep the creativity over here. Now, I don't recommend bringing the creativity to your bookkeeping or your legal matters. But other than that, I think we need to be bringing it into all areas of our organization. Sorry, I have really corny jokes. All right, diversity. So I like to think about this as both diversifying and creating meaningful inclusion, because I think that diversifying without creating meaningful inclusion probably won't work too well. I also want to acknowledge that this is not my area of expertise, but as a white woman, I want to sort of speak to the white-led organizations in the room about what I'm seeing and some places I think we can start. I think that we need to be creating meaningful inclusion both from the inside out. We can't just say we want more diverse audiences, but we don't want to change anything we're doing and expect a whole lot to happen. And we need to be letting the change happen from the outside in, which means really listening to those voices that may at the moment be external to our organization and letting them influence the way we work. We need to be listening. We need to be ready to change. We need to be thinking expansively about what it means to be inclusive. This is not just a matter of race and ethnicity. This is a matter of age. This is a matter of socioeconomics. This is a matter of all manners of diversity within our communities. If we genuinely want more young people, that thing that I've heard every day since I entered this field, if we genuinely want more young people, we're going to have to do something different. And actually getting to know young people and listening to them is a pretty good place to start. Avoid token gestures. So one of the things that I get asked a lot is, can you help us get somebody diverse on our board? Well, first of all, one person isn't diverse. One person is one person. And we, especially if we are white dominated organizations, probably able-bodied dominant organizations, we need to be thinking about not ever bringing somebody in new and different on their own, because then it's too easy for them to get quieted by the dominant group. So what does that look like? And again, for white folks, as a fellow white person, I invite you to think really hard about your language and practices around diversity and equity and inclusion. I think that we too often invite people, as I mentioned before, to what we like to call our organizations. And we do that without allowing the meaningful inclusion that might create change within our organizations, because we like them the way they are and we don't really want them to change. But you got to pick. Do you want meaningful inclusion, or are you unwilling to change? Because those things aren't necessarily going to go together. And you might find that the change that's being asked is not at all the change you expect, because each of us is limited by our own perspective. Again, not my primary area of expertise, and so I'll say one more thing and leave it to voices that are more qualified than I am. But I have noticed a great deal that the language around diversity in white-led organization often recenters that whiteness. So it becomes about getting different people and other people and that sort of thing that recenters the sort of white supremacist dominant position within the organization. And so we have work to do, white person to white people, in really thinking about the language we're using and the way that we're approaching these issues, because I think the language is a reflection of some of the thoughts that have been really pervasive within our field and community. All right. So this is kind of the grand finale here. So the time for innovation just isn't over. I think it's really tempting to think like, but we did the change thing, Sarah, right? We did that. Things changed. We had a pandemic. We did the innovation thing. And now we're going to get back to normal. We're going to move from here to there. But we can't do that, right? Audiences aren't just going to come back as we open the doors. Programming isn't just going to go back to normal because we want it to. Our gig workers and artists have been profoundly affected, and you may find some of your favorite ones are no longer around. because they've changed careers. I know many out of necessity who've done that. So it's tempting to think we can be done with innovation, but we can't. This is a time, again, for more change, I'm so sorry, and rapid innovation and iteration. But it will keep happening, right? Over the next several months, we are going to see reopenings and returnings, but we don't know exactly how many people are going to come back on day 1 and how many people are going to come back on day 15 and how many people are going to come back in 3 months. And so we have to be agile enough to keep being responsive and keep turning that dial to get it tuned into the right place, knowing that 2 weeks later, the dial is going to need to be in a different place. So how do we set ourselves up for that? Rather than bearing down hard, how do we keep ourselves light and able to keep fine-tuning that? Also, give yourself some grace there and recognize that you may not always get that dial tuned in exactly right, but be responsive. Okay, what just happened? We thought that was going to work. Why didn't it? Relatedly, this isn't going, that's a really junky picture, but it was the best thing I could find that described what I wanted to say. This isn't going to be linear, right? We're going to kind of go left and right and back and forward, and that's all right. We just have to be ready for it. It's that expectation being half the battle piece. So what I want to almost end with is this: change is not a dirty word, right? When we are overworked and tired, and we are as individuals, which we are, like we're humans, we're not just worker bees in an arts organization. When we're that sort of existentially bone tired, the prospect of perpetual change makes a lot of us want to curl up in a cave with a weighted blanket and a whole lot of chocolate, or maybe that's just me. But here's what I anticipate. We are in for another year of rapid change. We don't know exactly what it's going to look like, but we do know that our audiences will return, just at varying rates. We may have to straddle some kind of virtual and live divide, possibly forever. New expectations and doors have been opened, but at least for a little while. And you'll need to make that decision for your organization and your audience. Our budgets and our personnel may be shifting repeatedly. It's going to be a year that requires our most nimble and creative selves. It'll be a year when we need to find good questions to ask of the right people and do it frequently. There's a lot that none of us know, but I do know that creating meaningful engagement with our communities will help sustain our organizations into the future. So personally, I think all of this is actually good news in some ways. Not the pandemic, that's not good news. But we've been given this once in a, I don't know how many years, once since the nonprofit sector was formed, opportunity where almost everything just got thrown up in the air. And we have a chance to decide where the pieces land. And I don't want to see our field squander that chance. We can make decisions for what we want our organizations in this field to look like. So let's do it. And let's do it with some intention. When that happens, when something external like a pandemic throws everything up in the air, the other thing we may find is that there is more fertile soil right now within our organizations for creating change that may be a long time coming. We've sort of recognized things need to be different. And so this is your chance. If you've been saying, I really wish we would fill in the blank, this may be your chance to find that board buy-in or that senior leadership buy-in that maybe has been missing before to get some of that done. So before I conclude and we open up for questions for the last 30 minutes or so here, I just want to very briefly show you 2 frameworks that I think can be helpful as we're handling all those questions that I went through before and stressed us all out. So the first is the design thinking model, and you can find plenty about this online. I'm not going to give you a full tutorial, but there are a couple of things I want to point to here. The first is the rooting in empathy, which means relationships, right? It's requiring that we develop an understanding of the other. And before we can expect our audience to understand what we're going through, it's really our job to understand, to be the grown-up, to understand what they're going through, and to take that role. The other one I want to point, the other thing about this I want to say is the rapid iteration, right? We try something and then we reevaluate, and then we try something and then we reevaluate. The other is something called jobs to be done theory, which comes out of Harvard and from the late Clay Christensen. And the basic premise is that any organization or company, I mean, it was developed for-profit companies, fills different roles in people's lives. Essentially, someone is hiring you to do a job in their life. That's what their donation is, or that's what their ticket money is, or whatever it might be. Some of those jobs are functional. They could be social, they could be emotional, they could be aspirational. And this is, again, one of those places where we tend to put ourselves in that emotional and aspirational space. But often what people are asking of us is something very functional. You provide a really good place for my kid to go to camp and I need childcare and I feel really good. There's that aspirational about them getting that arts education, but really I need them to go to camp. So like, if your camp is only half days and I need full days, it doesn't matter how aspirational I am. It doesn't fill my functional need. Put another way, one of the images that's often used here is that people don't want a 1/4 inch drill. They want a 1/4 inch hole. And they're looking for the best tool to create a 1/4 inch hole for them. So how do we figure out what the 1/4 inch holes are in our community and become the best way that they can fill those?